Hello everyone, Wordup again, and I'm here with part 2 of 3 of my initial Enhancement Legion overview. Again, this will be me talking over some background dungeon footage of Niltharin's lair in a similar format. As I covered general gameplay and the feel of the spec in the first video, this is going to be entirely dedicated to the new talent tree system given to us in Legion. This is definitely subject to change in the near future, as Blizzard have stated that there are going to be future changes on the way for Enhancement, so this video's main purpose is as a reference point for where the new age of Enhancement began for this expansion. If you want to jump ahead to any of the specific talent tiers that you're interested in, you can click any of the links on the screen right now, which will lead you to the appropriate part of the video with them in and me talking about them. And with that, we're going to jump straight into the talent analysis. Level 15 comes without much of a unified theme. Windsong is a 30-second cooldown attack with a big 15-second long 50% attack speed buff attached to it. It deals slightly more nature damage than Rockbiter as it scales from spell power as opposed to attack power currently, and with the new Storm Fury / Wind Fury mechanics being so important then, the flow of combat is aided a lot with the simple auto attack contribution of this ability being used. And given that the resource generation is what limits us now, this is a solid, good talent. With it being a 50% uptime as well, it translates to a quite frequent and short burst of damage that scales directly with, say, Doomwinds if you choose to sync them up in a situation on a fight. With it only being an attack speed buff though, it has no impact on the global cooldown or anything that scales directly with haste. It's purely there to ramp up that swing timer, but it does, however, amplify the high and low swing I mentioned in the gameplay video, as it increases the high points of damage more frequently, but without the next talent I'm going to talk about, the low points become much more obvious. So second, a very simple passive option is Spiritual Resonance. This adds a flat 10 extra Maelstrom to any Rockbiter cast, and per second to the Feral Spirit's cooldown buff. The Rockbiter bonus does not scale with the artifact perk that grants a chance for double resource, but it is a good tool for smoothing out the rotation. It's also definitely preferable for situations where you need to consistently keep Fury of Air on cooldown if you take that talent, and also actively use Crash Lightning, as with no other passive sources of Maelstrom, it can really be a struggle to keep resources flowing in. Overall, it's another great talent, and the two work well in the tier together in different situations, creating a solid choice. Sadly, the third option, Fists of Stone, is one I can't recommend in any circumstance. Its upside of 5% damage and 10% crit for 10 seconds is nowhere near enough to offset losing 50% attack speed, which, as mentioned before, is now quite important to keep resources flowing, as passive generation is significant, especially when you consider the two talents that you're going to be losing to take it. On top of that, it has the extra negative of slowing you as well, so I see no reason for this talent to be taken, nor even in its current state for it to exist. I can understand the design idea of slower but harder hitting attacks, and can in some ways forgive the fantasy aspect of being snared, but the bonus is so inconsequential for the downsides that it makes me wonder if it could ever really be balanced in a reasonable way that it'd be worth taking. Level 30 is a mobility-oriented tier, the first of which is Gust of Wind. It's a short 15-second cooldown jump that's almost identical in distance to Goblin Rocket Jump. It has slight elevation with a tiny time delay, and it will clip on terrain, so it doesn't play friends with any mild inclines or hills, unfortunately. Otherwise, it's a pseudo-blink that I'm sure will have some solid uses and adds to the already quite solid mobility in our kit. Second choice is Feral Lunge. This is a charge with a damage component that isn't currently implemented on the alpha, on a 30-second cooldown that requires Ghostwolf to be active. Distance-wise, it's slightly further than Gust of Wind and obviously has the damage component, but the restrictive nature of requiring a target I think will make it a lot less versatile, on top of it requiring the global beforehand to get into Ghostwolf before you cast it, and on top of that has double the cooldown. Finally, there's Windrush Totem. This is in some ways similar to the aura that Primal Storm Elemental currently gives on live, but also leaves a lingering buff for 5 seconds after you leave the area, which is a really welcome change. It's a raid-wide 60% sprint in a 10-yard radius around the totem that can be cast at a range of 40 yards on a 1-minute cooldown, lasting for 15 seconds. This buff does refresh while you're in the zone, which makes it particularly potent if you place it in a dangerous raid zone, or even between the raid and the destination that they're going to be moving to. Its short 1 minute cooldown, coupled with its potential duration, I find makes it an incredibly strong utility tool, and even on a personal level, it's a 1 minute cooldown sprint if you cast it at your feet. Definitely a great choice, and currently I think is the dominant talent on the tier for raiding at the very least. Though Gust of Wind is definitely a strong competitor, Feral Lunge has the added advantage of dealing damage, which makes it a distinct choice, and as such I think this is a very well designed tier with defined options. Level 45 I could dub the CC tier, and firstly all 3 are totems, and as such all totems can be cast at a 35 yard range now on a targeted area, instead of needing totemic projection to move them, as that's now gone. First option is Lightning Surge Totem, which in every way is identical to an unglyphed capacitor totem on live. All of the issues of the totem have already been discussed ad nauseum in WOD and even further back in MOP, and they all apply here as well, sadly. As a small tangent, I really like the idea of the player being able to actively detonate it on a scaling stun duration, based say on how long it's been charging, to make it more usable or dynamic, but as it is now, it's effectively the most difficult to set up stun across all classes, and by extension the most difficult to capitalise on. With the glyph gone as well, the 5-second wind-up I believe will restrict it from being useful for another expansion outside of 5-mans if it remains as is. Second choice is Earthgrab Totem. Now, we've completely lost Earthbind, so it has a bit more value as it's now no longer replacing something, but functionally it's the same as on live with the distance casting added. Lastly, there's the new Voodoo Totem, which replaces Hex on a shorter 30-second cooldown, and the bonus is that it pulses every 5 seconds for 10 seconds, hexing anything within 3 yards around it for 10 seconds, though enemies can only be hexed 1 time by each totem. With it being an instant CC zone, I can see it having some interesting uses, but the radius of the pulse is extremely short, which means precision targeting will be needed to make use of the totem, which can be a luxury in fast-paced fights. I think this tier needs a bit of work in general. Earthgrab works fine, simply now that Earthbind is gone, but the other 2 options do have some pretty significant drawbacks and issues that may curtail their use in raids in particular. Dungeons, I can see where they can be applied, so less so, in a similar sense to live. Now, back to the damage-oriented tiers, we have the level 60 talents, starting off with an old classic Lightning Shield. This is a 15-second buff now that costs 20 Maelstrom to activate and 5 per second to maintain, that deals nature damage to a single target within 10 yards every half second, dealing 25% of your spell power on a 1 minute cooldown. The total cost of the cast is a deceptively restrictive 95 Maelstrom for a quite tame 750% spell power total damage. Whilst it's definitely an interesting talent, and I do like the concept, unfortunately, it's going to struggle to find its place if it remains there, between the scaling and the cost, and even more so, the alternatives on the same tier. There is room, I think, for it to move and be tuned against other options that drain Maelstrom, but currently it's the weakest by a significant amount on the tier that it's on. Next is Ancestral Swiftness. Similar to Live, although the passive effect has been doubled to 10% haste and attack speed, and the free instant cast per 1.5 minutes has been removed, as we rarely cast anything now. As stated earlier, increased attacks are more valuable now they directly contribute to resource, so it's a much more solid option, and the increased value makes it quite a significant gain. Finally on the tier, there's Landslide, which is a personal favourite, which causes Rockbiter casts to grant 20% increased attack power for 10 seconds. Whilst it sounds fairly boring, it is just a maintenance buff that needs little maintenance as you already cast Rockbiter so often. It's a huge damage increase, and it's a semi-permanent spell, but it buffs our primary scaling stat, whilst also playing into the theme of enhancing ourselves through our elemental casts. I think it's a solid, simple and effective talent to pair with Swiftness on a tier, which is also why Lightning Shield seems so out of place. Perhaps switching it with Windsong in this row to further the enhancing options between passive, active and proc design could resolve that on this. Level 75 is somewhat of a mixed bag for me at the moment. Starting with Tempest, this causes Stormfury to effectively have 2 charges when it procs, which I quite like given how we're already getting a lot out of procs and stacking mastery. It also allows a lot more room for refreshing procs as you're emptying your previous procs and smoothing out the general gameplay and making the aspect of keeping Stormstrike on cooldown less demanding. Generally, this is one of my favourite talents added, in particular due to its interesting extra scaling with mastery as a stat that we're likely going to now be stacking. Second comes Spiritual Affinity, which is a flat 1 minute reduction off the cooldown of Feral Spirit. This is a strong synergy with Spiritual Resonance, obviously, for the extra Maelstrom power gain, and gives us a 50% uptime on the 50% haste and Maelstrom power buff from Feral Spirit itself, alongside the small damage boost of them attacking. It basically doubles our burst windows, and having that synergy there, I think, between talents is great for having multiple builds and identity in trees oriented around different playstyles, or, more importantly, different fight archetypes that you can switch between. As such, I hope that currently unavailable artifact perks lend themselves as strongly to a wolf-centric build as currently available ones do for Tempest, which is currently not the case. Finally, there is Thrall's Heroes of the Storm Ultimate, Sundering. Recently, it received a tremendous buff from 30% up to 500% of attack power, and it's on a 20-second cooldown with a 6-3 Maelstrom power cost. This is effectively the AoE spell of the tier with the marginally useful knockback, which could possibly be detrimental to some raid success, with a deceptively short range. I do like the spell conceptually, but the cost is very restrictive given that AoE is already very intensive on Maelstrom consumption, and that both alternatives in Affinity and Tempest can increase that generation or reduce the cost enough to allow a more aggressive, sustained AoE platform. However, given how high the AP scaling is, for a burst damage AoE cooldown for adds, this could definitely see some use, and in particular in 5-man content, where the knockback could potentially be capitalised on to interrupt adds, for example. Level 90 is sadly probably one of the worst balanced tiers, past, present, or future, that we've ever had. It almost entirely starts and ends with the first talent, Fury of Air, which is basically a Shaman Bladestorm, costing 20 Maelstrom power to cast, and 5 per second for 10 seconds. This is a total of 70 Maelstrom power on a 30-second cooldown, but it also provides a slow around you and deals a massive amount of physical damage to any targets unfortunate enough to get close. A possibly overtuned and misplaced talent, it's actually very fun to use, as anything is when it's doing so much damage, but it has the interesting dynamic of Maelstrom power maintenance. Its primary issue, though, sadly, is that the talents competing with it are possibly irredeemable. Second on the tier is Crashing Storm, which doubles the range of Crash Lightning, adding 4 yards to its base. Crash Lightning currently deals quite poor damage, and whilst its activation range is awkwardly low and is helped by this, its splash range for the damage is not, making it virtually impossible for this talent to ever compete with the AoE damage that Fury of Air brings, whilst providing nothing in single target, which Fury of Air does in spades, to make it more desirable. Third is Stormfist Strike, a similar spell to Stormbolt from Warriors, with a 5-second stun on a 30-second cooldown, dealing double damage to stun immune targets that costs 30 Maelstrom. It also currently deals extremely low damage, despite the multiplier, meaning that unless you absolutely require a long duration single target stun, it's not going to be usable. This is made even worse by the competition of Fury of Air, in that it's highly unlikely that any other player in the group would lose taking a stun more than you would not taking Fury of Air. This pushes Stormfist even further down the list of talents that are usable. Lastly, there's the level 100 tier. This begins with our old 3-minute cooldown, Ascendance, which has been shifted to a talent and had its duration doubled to 30 seconds, alongside its cooldown being increased to 5 minutes. It also now generates 4 Maelstrom power per second for a total of 120 over its duration, but maintains the modification of attacks and Storm Strike to Windlash and Windstrike. It does also reduce the base cooldown of Storm Strike down to 8 seconds to make it more usable while the spell is active. This is an incredibly strong talent for opening burst and cooldown stacking, and I found that it also allows for free and liberal usage of spenders whilst it's active, especially when you stack up wolves and sync them together, causing it to be an extremely potent offensive cooldown, whilst also still keeping the utility of being a briefly ranged class. Second is Feral Kin. This increases the cooldown of Feral Spirit up to 5 minutes, or 4 if you take Affinity, and causes it to summon a single larger wolf under your control. Currently, a couple of the bonus skills aren't scaling at all and are dealing virtually no damage, and the wolf itself deals pretty much the same damage as individual wolves do when untalented, though this is offset by the fact that it lasts for 30 seconds as opposed to 15. Currently, this talent seems extremely underwhelming, especially compared to Ascendance, and I'd rather see it have the cooldown increase removed and relegated to a utility talent, say on a tier with Stormfist Strike, potentially even switching tiers with Fury of Air and keeping the active spells related to healing. Lastly, there is Earthen Spike. a 20-second cooldown short-range physical nuke that is intended to deal roughly similar damage to Storm Strike that costs 20 Maelstrom power, and leaves a 10-second debuff on the target, increasing damage taken from physical and nature sources for 10 seconds. Currently, the debuff is not affecting Shaman skills, so it's hard to judge, but again, the cost at current gear levels on the alpha of 60 extra Maelstrom power a minute is restrictive for its marginal benefit, and the alternative generating talent in Ascendance, its shorter cooldown though means it has more potential in non-burst oriented fights, and assuming the bug of it supposedly affecting other players is rightfully removed, as such should be a relatively break-even and competitive choice with Ascendance. That's all of the tiers then of the new enhancement tree, and some individual opinions on each of them as I went along. It is a little longer than I expected it to be, but some of the talents there's a lot more to say than others. The final video before the next pass, hopefully, is also in the works, which is a more speculative approach focusing on suggestions and where a shaman may or may not fit into a raid, and ideally I'll be taking a quick look at some of the more important artifact perks as well that are available. Hopefully you found this as interesting as the first video, and if you did, please leave a like and subscribe for more shaman content or even just Legion content in general, and I hope to see you in the final video.